What do you think is the role of deeper brain structures like thalamus, hypothalamus, brainstem?
So let me repeat the question. What are the role of deeper brain structures like the thalamus or the subthalamus and so on? Well, it's very, very, let me just break it into a couple of things. The thalamus is part of the cortical system. So when we model this stuff, we're thinking about the thalamus. It's not, I didn't break it out separately, but there's some structures like that that are part of cortical modeling. So the thalamus is one of those. Other things, let's talk about, the cortex is not the center of emotions. The cortex is not, it really has nothing to do with your emotionals and your sex drive and hunger and all these things. That's all subcortical. The cortex is sort of a model. It's a model of the world. And the cortex itself doesn't even evaluate which behaviors you should have. That's done in the basal ganglia. So the cortex is basically sort of like, it's objective. It's Dr. Spock. It says, you know what? Well, this could happen if you do this, and this could happen if you do that, and this could happen. And the older part of the brain goes, oh, shit, that's really dangerous. Don't want to do that. And from an evolutionary point of view, the cortex appears very late. It's not a highly evolved organ. It appeared recently. It hasn't been under a lot of evolutionary pressure. So essentially, it sits on top of the other brain. The brain is still there. The other parts of the brain are like a reptile. You got a reptile inside of you. That's why we do stupid things sometimes. Like, eat that piece of cake. I don't know. Don't eat it. Yeah, I'm going to eat it. So the cortex sits on top of it. And the way I like to view it is it's a non-emotional model of the world. And it interfaces to everything below, and it doesn't really know that stuff existed. It doesn't really know what it is. The beauty of how this works is the cortex can, in some ways, say, I don't really care what all the stuff going on below me is. I have ability to influence, and I learn how to influence associatively. I also get inputs from the world, and so the details of all this stuff is really kind of oblivious to the cortex. And it has to be the case in the way it evolved. And there's a lot been written about this topic. So I believe you can build a real serious cortical system using things like the thalamus and some, maybe parts of the hippocampus. But ignoring most everything else, you're just not going to get an emotional being. You're not going to get something that replicates and wants to eat or anything of that stuff. It's just going to be a model of sensory data, a sensory motor model of the world. And that's what machine intelligence is all about. It's not trying to build human-like things. And therefore, the tools we're working on here are never going to pass the Turing test. Because to pass the Turing test, you've got to be human. But we're not trying to do that. Next question. Up front. Right up here.
Oh, thanks. I've been working with NewPick for about a year and enjoying it immensely. But one thing I'm a little fuzzy on still is what is the method that you're using to make sure that the HTM algorithms are in sync with the current science? I'm not really clear how that.
So how do we know if the HTM algorithms are in sync with current science, current neuroscience?
Yeah. Yes.
That's primarily what we're concerned about. The way we do this is there's no magic to it. We read neuroscience papers, lots of them. I think I calculated, I've read several thousand in my life by now. And if you ever read neuroscience papers, they're not easy. They often take quite a bit of effort to get through. But the way we might go about, let's say we're working on layer 4 stuff right now. We're trying to do sensory motor inference. So I say, well, look, we know the brain has to solve this. I'm guessing it's happening in layer 4. Well, let's go read what we know about that. And then say, oh, well, you know what? We need to have a motor command coming in there. Well, is there a motor? I didn't know this. Is there motor commands being passed into layer 4? Well, you go dig in the literature and you say, oh, yes, there are. But maybe it's actually going into layer 6, which is being projected to layer 4. So you follow these sort of trails. And the neuroscience literature can often be very contradictory. One person says X, another person says Y. But we read these papers in detail, and we say, well, it looks like the preponderance of evidence suggests that this is the pathway. And then sometimes we find things that just don't work, and we say, that can't work. I was pursuing an idea for something we call temporal pooling, and I was pursuing the idea using these things called metabotropic receptors. And I was really excited about it. And I said, oh, this is going to solve the problem. I think it's going to really be great, great, great. And I wrote to my a neuroscience friend, Murray Sherman, who's at University of Chicago. I said, Murray, I think they're going to do this, this. And he goes, no, Jeff, it doesn't look like that at all. And I go, shit. Oh, excuse me. And I said, I had to reset and go back. So that's basically what we do. We read papers, we study them, we ask scientists, what do you think? Is this real? Could it work like this? No, let's try something else. Yes, it's supportive evidence. When we did the basic sequence memory here, there was a huge number of assumptions about how dendrites worked. And so we had to do a deep dive into dendritic theory to see is it supported, and it was. And so we said, that gives us really confidence that we thought theoretically it had to work this way. And now we find the neuroscience evidence that it does work that way. So it's almost like we can do experiments because there's so much neuroscience literature that no one could possibly know at all. And so you pose the question, you pose your experiment, then you go dig into the neuroscience literature, and you often, almost always, find the answer someplace.
So there's a little follow-up to that.
I'll repeat it. Yeah, go ahead.
Is there a way to test that your implementation is matching the science?
Is there a way to test that implementation? Well, okay, the question is, do we actually test this? I kind of said we did in some sense that we run these experiments and then we can again test them against the existing literature. We can say, well, the results we got are this. Can I find supporting evidence for that? We haven't really tried or been successful at, we haven't really tried to go and say, well, here's a new experiment that's no one ever's done before, and let's go do that experiment on an animal. Now, the reason we haven't done this is because those experiments are very, very complex and expensive, and they take years sometimes to run. And we don't have a wet lab. So the best thing we can do is call up some neuroscience friends and say, have you done this before? And what did you find? And often I'll find they'll say, like, well, yeah, we found that, but I didn't report it because we didn't know what the hell it was about, but we did find that. So to me, that's an experiment. And then as new literature comes in, we're looking at it all the time. It's something new comes in, it's like, oh, that's a really interesting thing. Oh, that's contrary to what we thought. So it's a very iterative process. We're not just blindly going into this. There's been many, many dead ends where our ideas were proved wrong, and then we had to go back to the drawing board, and we came up with usually a better idea, and then we found support for that. It's an unusual experimental process, but it is an experimental process. We make a hypothesis, we test it by finding out in the literature or in other neuroscientists' head, is that right or wrong? And that's how we do it. I think it's worked very well for us. This question up here, and we need the mic. Craig, you might want to hover up front here.
So you implied that saccades are inherent in vision, and that we interactively explore things, and that's a part of the process. Whereas as we've made photography and cameras, we've had a very, the camera should be stable, and now we have digital photography. It's all from a much different base. How would you make cameras differently in order to support vision?
I'm not sure why I would want to make a camera work differently. They seem to work pretty well right now. I guess I haven't thought about that question, and I'm going to pass on it. I'm not sure that's something I want to do. I think the real question is, how do I build a system that can see? And how do I build a system that can see as it's moving? And how do I build a system that can see when things are moving in the world? And I haven't yet thought of like, oh, I can build a better camera. Perhaps it's true, but cameras are pretty damn good, and I just haven't thought about that. I'm not sure there is an application there. I can take up front or that one over there.
We had a question over here.
It should be on. Right?
Yeah, so this is clearly a bio-inspired system. And I wonder, how do you make sure that you are following the principles of the biology rather than actually the symptom of it? This is really, I think you also mentioned it somewhere, saying that like the process of the White brothers, they're trying to invent the planes, right? They're really not trying to mimicking birds flapping the wings, rather they're trying to understand the, birds can fly because of the principle of proportion. So how do you make sure that
I got the first part of your question, but then I got lost. I couldn't hear the words. So you were asking, how do we know that we're sticking to biology, I think, which is similar to this gentleman's question, right? But then
yes, it's related. It's related, but I'm really questioning that how do you make sure that you are following the principle rather than just mimicking the symptom of the biology?
That's an easy question, I think. How do we know we're following the principles rather than mimicking the biology? We don't do any mimicking of biology. And it's very different, for example, the Human Brain Project in Europe, if you're familiar with that. That really is about mimicking the neurocortex. They're building models that they have no theoretical basis for, and they're running them to see how they go. They're sort of mimicking the biology. We don't do that at all here. If you haven't, I'll point out here, there are many things in the biology we don't touch at all. And the reason is because we don't have a theoretical need for them. So our neurons, give you a real basic one. Our neurons have very simple states. We don't model spikes. And real neurons have to be spiking. And almost every neuromorphic chip in the world has spiking neurons and all this stuff. Well, why don't we? Well, I don't have a theoretical need for modeling spikes. I can explain from a theory point of view why they're probably not necessary, but why they're necessary in biology. So I think if anything, you could fault me on the other way around. I think you might fault me for not adhering to enough of biology, that I've thrown away too many things. I've simplified it beyond, perhaps what it should be simplified. I've never had the criticism the other way, that we're mimicking too much. And yet, you can see we make very, very different decisions. Our neurons are very different, and our synapses are very different than almost any other neural model out there. They'll leave out essential things that other people think are essential, but we throw in a lot of stuff that other people haven't even considered. I don't know of a single other neural network model, a system theoretic neural network model, that takes advantage of thousands of synapses on dendrites and active dendritic properties. I don't know of another one. And why did we do that? Because we had a theoretical need for it, not because I thought it was cool. We backed into it. We said we have to be able to make all these predictions all the time, and the whole thing came together. So I think it's the opposite problem. You could have criticized me perhaps for throwing away too many things in the biology, but I think the process we're following is a good one. We add detail only when we have a theoretical need for it, only, never ever any other time. The tricky part is to knowing what not to include. That's the way science works, right? In the end, you have a very, very complex system. People say it's the most complex system they know about. And in the end, you want to come up with a simple, understandable way of understanding this thing. And the only way you can do that is to throw away a lot of the details and go to the essential theoretical components. And I tried to do that in this talk. OK, I'll take this question here. We got 1 more minute before I'm supposed to stop taking.
What are the next couple of big things you're thinking about you need to crack to really move forward into the next steps?
Well, I gave you the big picture of the next couple things. I said we're really working on the sensory motor stuff. I'd love to have a really cool vision system based on that. To me, I'll turn it into a more. I laid out a roadmap there, but I'm going to answer slightly. Maybe you were asking what do I think personally? What are the things that keep me up at night? Maybe. You remember this? Remember this? The goal-oriented behavior coming out of layer 5, right? I said about 50%. I've given talks about that. There's an online talk you can. Matt can tell you what the name is. I can't remember. But I've talked about that. I'm tantalizingly close to getting another 40% of that answer. It's so close. It keeps me up at night. There's a few things I just don't understand, and I can sense they're there. And so, to me, the next big breakthrough that I'm hoping we achieve is really understanding how that goal-oriented behavior comes out of these components in layer 5. And we've got a lot of the pieces. It's just not quite gelled yet. Whereas earlier this year, we really had a breakthrough on how layer 4 sensory motor inference worked. And that was a really nice event. It's like, oh, yeah, we can see how that's going to work. And now it's more like I'm stuck on the layer 5 thing. And I say stuck because it's just like, oh, it's so close. You can sense it. That's why I put it at 50%. It's like almost over the threshold. It's just like a new one idea. I think it's going to pop us into so the whole thing come together. That's how it feels to me personally. OK, I'll take one more question, then we're going to stop. I'll take the woman in the back there. And then I'll be available all the rest of the afternoon, too. So
we probably have time for a couple more.
Oh, you did? Well, the clock told me I was done. So I'll take 2 more.
We're a little bit ahead.
Oh, did I speak too quickly?
Hi. Yeah. How does HTM compares to Kurzweil work on biologically inspired models of intelligence? Because he's also taking...
Whose work?
Kurzweil or Google. Kurzweil.
Oh, Kurzweil.
Yeah.
Kurzweil. Oh, Kurzweil. Yeah.
Work on, because he's also taking this approach of like hierarchical pattern recognizers, even though there's not so much the temporal component.
Yeah, OK. So the question is about Ray Kurzweil. Ray is mostly, he's a self-claimed futurist, I guess. Is that something like that? I don't And he wrote a book about brains recently. It was funny because before he started writing the book, he called me up and he spent some time on the phone saying, what do you think of this idea? What do you think of that idea? I'll tell you, I'll just be very honest about it. I think Ray, he's got tremendous insights into the nature of technology evolution and accelerating change. I think that's his real strength. He's brilliant at that. I don't think he has a very deep understanding of neuroscience. And that comes from personal talking to him. And I don't, if you read his book recently, you won't find any kind of this kind of detail in there. There's nothing like that there. And I spent some time with Ray less than a year ago, I think it was, and chatted about this stuff. And I don't think he would disagree with what he just said. So I don't think they're working. He's working, and I know that the people at Google are not really working at this level of modeling and sort of theoretical thinking about it. But you know, I can't speak for him. Maybe he's doing something I don't know about. But when the last time I spoke to him, that's the assessment I got. Okay, one more question. Is that right? I'll take this gentleman down front here. Oh, well, I got two more. All right, two more, and then I don't want to like.
So vision has been studied a lot. You know, from the retina, the V1 region, all the way to the 5 regions. And how much are you trying to, like, for instance, there's a correspondence problem with 3D and things like that. How much are you trying to track that to see how you can apply these models to? Yeah,
so hopefully everyone heard that question. So there's a huge amount of information now known about the vision system. There's actually 2 visual pathways in the brain. And how much do we try to track that? Or model it. Or
model it to create vision systems.
So it's a great question. So let's just talk about vision a little bit. In humans, our vision system is more complex than I talked about here. We have something called a striate layer 4 in V1, meaning the layer 4 is actually 4 different layers, not 1 layer as I talked about it. There's these 2 parallel pathways. There's a ton of stuff that's known about this. However, if you go look, not all mammals have that. Not all mammals have a striate V1, and they see, right? So the way I view this is that the cortex has these common principles, and in certain cases, those principles have evolved beyond that to very more specific type of solutions. So our vision system is better than some other mammals' vision systems, and other mammals have different capabilities than us. We're not trying to track exactly one of those. We're trying to get at the core principles that apply to all of them. So I don't study, I think about it a lot, we read about it, but I'm not trying to model the striate V4, layer 4, because I know that you don't have to have that to see. And other mammals don't have that. So that's the kind of thinking we go through on this thing. Also, you know, we have these 2 visual pathways, and so we kind of figure out, there's all animals do that? Do we have to model both of them? What's the difference, and so on? I'll give you an example of something more positive on the other side. In the model here, I was talking about, you know, when I said the columns burst and the individual cells fire and so on. That was a prediction of this model. We theoretically came up with that idea. And I knew generally that when you have unpredicted inputs in the visual system, that you get more activity. And when you have predicted inputs in the visual system, you have much, much less activity. But then we found a paper, and I can't cite it now, I don't remember, but I can get it for you, Subotai will remember it. We found a paper which showed exactly what we talked about. Literally, that the individual cells fire in very precise points in time and sequences, exactly like we talked about. And so that was a very nice confirmation of this theory. So there's levels at which we do really, really care a lot about the details. But other ones, I'm trying to simplify the problem. I don't want to solve all possible types of vision. I want to get at the core principles. Once we understand those core principles, then we as humans, just like biology, can vary from that. We can do new things and clever tricks and so on. But you can't really do that until you get to the core principles. It's sort of like, you know, the core principles of computing were laid down by Van Neumann and Turing back in the 40s and in the 30s, actually. And those core principles have stayed the same, but we have lots of flavors of computers now and lots of different variations, and we can tweak them in different ways, you know, but you got to have the basic idea first, and that's what we're trying to do.
Why is learning so important rather than like actually coming up with an idea or coming up with a solution? I know you talked about it in your book on creativity and actually coming up with solutions and problem solving.
I'm not sure I understood that question.
Well, I think it's kind of the question of the general solution versus a specific.
Is that what it is? Is it a question about general solutions versus
I guess
specific?
the specific question would be, can NuPic generate ideas, or if you had these set of principles, would it be able to generate ideas? And
are we creating something that will sit down and come up with new ideas about things to do things and solve them proactively?
yeah, so if given information set, can it actually, for example, figure out how to build a self-driving car?
Wow, that's you're kind of jumping ahead there, aren't you? That's I think we've taken an approach which is a very patient approach. We've taken an approach which is started fundamental processes and fundamental learning theory and build up from that with the idea that really exciting things will be built upon that. It is not the quickest way to get to self-driving cars necessarily, or the quickest way to solve any particular solution. The general belief that we have is that if you build this foundation, if you really understand the principle of the cortex, that it could lead to things like that. I'm not predicting it will be like that, but you certainly don't want to shoot for that right now. You don't want to say, let's build a system that can, design computers and program them and then solve, the Ebola crisis. I mean, we're not there yet. We're modeling something which is 1,000th the size of a mouse cortex. And so you have to, you have to step before you run. I think it'd be nice. Things like that will happen over time. It's going to be miraculous things that come out of this this core technologies. But it all bases on learning. I mean, everything has. You can think of the world as in two things. You got programmed computers, which are programmed, and now you have to have things that learn. And we're just debating about how to make machines that learn. But you need to understand the fundamental processes of learning before you can go build something really dramatic like what you want to do. But it could get there. It's going to get there. I just don't know exactly where the end result is going to be. I don't know if I answered that question or not, but I tried to.
Take another one. You're going to have to do it, Jeff, because
you're going
to have mics.
Just give them the mic quickly, or I'll repeat the question.
Just a quick question. It's more a conceptual difficulty I have. Where is the learning happening? Where does it reside? What remembers the learning?
Okay, I'll take a stab at this, and then Subhato, you can add to it, right? In this case, we use the traditional type of Hebbian type learning. When a pattern comes in, it forms a representation. Another pattern comes in, it forms another representation. There's actually a learning process in that, how it forms a representation, but I'll just focus on the temporal learning. Each cell is constantly trying to form new connections, and when a cell becomes active, it increases, the learning occurs in the increase of the synaptic permanence. That's the learning. We use a Hebbian type learning rule. If a cell is firing and it looks for things that were firing prior to it, so it's a presynaptic and a postsynaptic event, we increase the synaptic, on that cell, we'll increase the synaptic permanence. That is the learning step. Also, those synapses can be forgotten. You can decrease them as well. But that is where the learning occurs. Well, the HTM is a learning system. I don't know if it becomes more intelligent. It learns more of the patterns in the world. It's constantly trying to discover the spatial temporal structure of the patterns that it's seeing. And it's constantly saying, here's a new pattern. I'll give you an example. Let's say I've learned a sequence, and it's a very repeatable sequence. Bum, 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 it's happening. And now you throw a bit of noise in there. Well, how does the HTM know that's noise, or how does it know that it's a new beginning of a new pattern? How does it know that it doesn't know? It has to assume, if you're going to build a continuous learning system, it has to assume that this new thing might be the thing that really I need to learn. It doesn't know. And so it may take 3 or 4 presentations before it says, I've seen it enough that I'm going to start believing it. That's an increase in their permanence. And it can say, but it has to continually learn, and it has to discover the structure, and it has to do so in the context of noise. And it doesn't know what's noise and what's structure until it's seen it multiple times. And then it starts to say that's the structure. After it's seen something 100 times, it says, yeah, I really got this. If all of a sudden the world changes and you start throwing at new patterns, it will start learning the new patterns, and if the memory capacity is reached, which is very large, if it really reaches a large thing, its failure is it'll start to generalize. It'll start to things that, let's say it's tried to learn 1 million different melodies, it's going to start hearing some of them similar and say, well, those are kind of that's the Wagner melody, and this is the Bach type of melody, things like that. So this is where learning occurs. This is how learning, it's continually happening, and it has a capacity, and when it reaches that capacity, it starts to generalize or forgetting things. I hope I answered that question. All right in front here, and I'll repeat the question. Yeah. Can we describe the encoders? We were sitting in the back of the room here saying, boy, we should have had a talk on encoders. Do you want to tackle this, or do you want me to do it?
Let's see what
Yeah, I mean, at a high level, I think Scott explained, for example, how the scalar encoder works. We have a number of these encoders for scalars, for categories, for timestamps, for geospatial coordinates, and so on. And for each of them, it's sort of a one-time kind of specific process to figure out exactly how to encode that data type into an SDR. But the basic rule is you just have to come up with a mechanism for encoding it into an SDR so that it has all the SDR properties that I listed on my site. And for some things, it's extremely simple, like the scalar encoder. It's very simple to a coarse coding strategy. And in other cases, like the geospatial encoder, it was not easy to figure it out. But once you implement it, the rest of the system works just fine. So that's kind of a high-level explanation of the encoders. I think it may be sort of beyond the scope to go into each specific one right now, but we can definitely do it in the
I bet you most people missed the description that Scott gave about how scalar encoders work. He mentioned it, but it went by pretty quickly. I don't know if it's...
Yeah, I mean, I can explain the scalar one really quickly. So let's say you have a number that you want to encode. You want to have a sparse binary vector that encodes that number. Right? And if you want to have the properties of SDRs in that vector. So if you have a number like, let's say your numbers go from 0 to 100. You have a number like 50, it might come up with a certain number of bits that are on. If you have nearby numbers like 51, you want to have a representation which overlaps very highly with 50. So what we typically do is we have, let's say you have your W as 40 in this case, the number of on bits. So if your numbers go from 0 to 100 and the number you're trying to encode is 50, you'll have the middle 40 bits on. And as the numbers go towards 0, that set of 40 bits will kind of slide off to the left. So 49 will be pretty overlapped with 50, and 0 might not overlap at all. But at any point in time, you're going to have a fixed 40 bits on out of 1,000 or whatever. And as the numbers go towards 100, you'll slide the set of 40 over to the right. So again, you'll have overlapping representations all along the way. So that's a very simple kind of encoder. We have more complex.
That one was modeled on the idea of the cochlear, where in the cochlear in your ear, you have this strip of cells that each cell has a frequency band it responds to. And so at any point in time, any particular sound frequency will capture a bunch of cells that have overlapping frequency bands. And so that was the concept of that was the modeling encoder. I'll give you a little advanced encoder lesson. We've come up with a clever way using some of the interesting properties of SDRs to make a fixed set of bits represent almost an infinite number of objects, which is, if you just had to visualize in your mind what Subutai just said, if you have a number along the number line that you're going to have some number of bits on, and if you move along, then some of those bits drop off and some pick up and so on. You always have this overlap. Well, you can continue the number on, if I say, I'm going to encode this with 1,000 bits, I can, if I randomly randomly reuse bits from the original 0 to 100, so let's say I map from 0 to 100, and there's 1,000 bits, I can randomly reassign those to positions beyond the end of the number line. And so the bits are being used to represent not only a band from, let's say, 1 to 5, but now from 100 to 120. A particular bit, an individual bit means multiple things now, but the ensemble, the sparse representations, the distributed representation is always going to be unique out there. So you can actually just sort of reassign these bits for on and on and on, and it goes on not forever, but pretty far. And we did the same thing with the geospatial encoder. We have some number of bits. I don't know what we ended up with the number of bits in that encoder.
I think Jaden probably knows 500 or...
Throw out the number if you know it. 40? Oh, we did
40
more than 40.
on.
40 on out of how many? Out of 2048. So we we actually did the same sort of trick of reusing these bits, and so we figured out, I think, Chaitan, you did the math on this, or was it, I think it was it you who did it? We figured out we could encode pretty much everywhere on the planet in 3 dimensions on the surface of the planet with high resolution using those 2048 bits, and we would never have a mistake. So some clever engineering can go into the encoders, and we should have a talk on it. We just didn't do that.
Yeah.
And let me just add on the encoders that they're all available in NuPic, so you can use our encoders. Of course, if you have a new data type that we haven't created an encoder for, then you can create an encoder, but you don't have to start over yourself on the encoders. You start with our encoder.
We did the GPS encoder by just starting with our linear encoder.
Yeah, what I find really kind of cool about this whole encoder idea is that it's one thing to think about numbers and dates and categories and stuff, but in this world, we're creating lots of different types of sensors that we've never seen before, and certainly the cortex was never evolved for. But all you have to do, and this geospatial encoder is an example of that, is figure out how to take that sensory data and encode it in a manner that matches all the SDR properties. And once you do that, you can now apply all of this cortical processing to that data stream. So it doesn't matter if it's GPS or radar data or ultrasound or whatever. As long as you can figure out how to encode it into SDRs, you can now use this very flexible learning algorithm.
And I had a question at the break, which I think might be worth on this same topic. This is our encoder talk right now.
This is the encoder talk we did.
Yeah, is that the encoders are sort of a tuned part of the system. They are specific to the data type you're dealing with, unlike the HTM. The cortex is generic. It's like the cortex is generic and your eyes and your ears are very specific. And so it turns out that with these encoders, you could make some that are better for the particular problem and some that are worse for the particular problem. But as long as they have the properties, they all seem to work. It's like we have a retina, and dogs have a retina, and a cat have a retina. They're all quite different. We all can see. Now, humans see better than dogs and cats for various reasons, but all those animals can see. In the same way here, you don't have to get this all right to have the system work. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to follow the rules, and basically follow the rules, we find the system generally works. And you can optimize it, and the place you optimize those systems mostly is in encoder space. You can do sort of optimization there, just like evolution has optimized our eyes and our ears for very specific problems that we face. Question back there. Yeah.
No, biology standpoint, where do you think the encoding is happening? Is it by the sensor itself or
What was the question?
Biological
in biology, where does this
in
encoding
biology,
happen?
where's the encoding happening?
Oh, I thought that was obvious. I'm sorry. It is the sensory organs.
Yeah.
Your eyes take in light, and the retina passes out a sparse coating. It's a very low-level sparse coating. Same with your ears, same with your skin. Once it's on the other side of the sensory organ, it's sparse coating of patterns. Right here. From the business perspective, do you see, because the HTM algorithm is so kind of flexible and universal, so from the business perspective, do you see more business encoders in this case?
More business in what?
Encoders?
No.
Oh.
No, not at all. No. I'm not sure why you get to that conclusion. Maybe I was talking to you about this earlier. We don't spend a lot of time on encoders. Trust me. This is the easy part of the whole thing. They go a long way, and they're not that hard to produce. So the trick is building the rest of the system is far more complicated and far more difficult, and takes a lot more theory to understand how it works, and we have a lot more research to do there. So no, I think the encoders are just sort of like colors on the car, or they're just options.
Well, I see them as enabling technology. So for us, we want to get them out there and let people use them as much as they can. That's why we got them all in open source.
We've spent years developing these HTM algorithms. We produced a GPS encoder in a matter of a week. It's not that hard. This gentleman back here.
3 or 4 years ago, you had a developer workshop that I attended, probably some other people that did down in Santa Clara. I'm wondering if you could give a synopsis of what has changed in NuPic from 3 or 4 years ago to now.
I'm assuming your question is, what has changed since we had a developer workshop a number of years ago which you said 3 or 4 years ago. Well, 3 or 4 is a very critical number. 4 years ago was one thing. 3 years ago was something else. Here's what happened. Basically, we had the concepts of HTM for many years now. I wrote about them in my book, which is about 7, 8 years old now, or something like that. No, more than that. It's got to be. I don't know what it is. How old is this book? Anyway, but the details. We were struggling with the details, how to learn sequences and how to do all this stuff. When we had the early HTM workshops, the last time we had a workshop, we had not figured out any of the stuff we presented here today. I would have presented the same concept. HTM is a hierarchy of similar regions. Each are learning sequences, doing this. But we didn't understand SDRs. We didn't understand how these neurons work. We didn't understand how these layers work. We didn't understand how the columns work. We didn't understand how the synapses work. We didn't understand any of this stuff. Specifically, we didn't really understand SDRs. And it was only when the SDR concept came along and we truly got a deep grokking of what SDRs are, then we were able to, everything else flowed from that. So look, if I could turn the clock back and do it all over again and start off with what we know now, sure, but it's not so easy to do that. It's a learning process. But we are definitely, I'll stake anything on it, that stuff I presented today is going to be around here for a long time.
All right, why don't you take one more, maybe? Right here.
One more?
Yeah.
So with deep neural nets, one of the things they've done is they kind of found that similar algorithms to neural nets are kind of similar to PCA. They do dimensional reduction with unsupervised learning. And I get the feeling that you're kind of looking at some of similar functionality out of this technology. Is that, am I right in that? I mean, do you get dimensional reduction when you get like this many dimensions coming in with patterns?
Yeah, well, one of the...
Repeat the question.
So the question is, in the deep learning community, they find that a lot of times these learning algorithms lead to principal components analysis and to a very efficient compressed representation of the data. I'm just paraphrasing. And do our algorithms do kind of the same thing? And I think one of the big kind of insights in the whole sparse coding realm was that you actually don't want a minimal representation. It's actually better for the learning algorithm to have a less optimal overcomplete set of basis functions. And that's actually better for the learning algorithm. And so although we're not using the same sparse coding algorithms that are used by Bruno Olshausen and others, that same kind of philosophy definitely applies here. And that's some of what I was trying to get at earlier. Our representations are not optimal from an information theoretic standpoint. They're expanded and they're sort of overcomplete, but it makes the job of learning much, much easier when you're in that representation space. So I think that philosophy is consistent with that. Some of the differences are, we're binary and a lot of those representations are analog. I don't think they really think about this union property at all. They don't think about temporal sequences and how to make multiple predictions about the future in the same representation and so on. I think they'll have to face some of those questions as they think about time. So things like the union property they don't talk about at all. So those are some of the differences, but
like you got to find like semantic nearness of across many dimensions. Like maybe that gets done somewhat by your encoders.
It's not the encoders.
yeah.
So you get some of the...
It's critical to our system that similar inputs give rise to similar SDRs. That's absolutely critical, and the learning algorithms ensure that, and the temporal pooling ensures that, and all of that. So that is absolutely...
We didn't go into temporal pooling here in depth today, which is a concept I brushed against, which is the idea of these stable representations over multiple changing inputs. You can think about this whole system as, in some sense, a dimensionality reduction or dimensionality changing type of system, but it's, as Subutai said, it's not really the goal of the system. I think we're going to have to leave it at that because I think Donna wants to wrap up, and I think but
we're around. We're
going to be around. We're going to be all out here. You can watch the demos and talk to us.
Okay.
Thanks.